Welcome to the West Cork History Festival 2021. As you all know, the festival this year is being conducted entirely virtually for reasons that are evident, and all of it will be available on our website at www.westcorkhistoryfestival.org. And this year, we're pursuing in the festival two broad themes. One connected to the events in Ireland in 1921, the end of the War of Independence and partition, and the other, not wholly disconnected, a study or set of reflections on aspects of Ireland and empire. And it's in connection with the second of those themes that our speaker today will address us, because we're very fortunate to have David Reynolds come and talk to us on the subject, English Memory and Amnesia about empire. David is Professor Emeritus of International History at the University of Cambridge. He is probably the preeminent scholar of British-US relationships in the course of the 20th century, with books like Rich Relations and America, Empire of Liberty. But most recently, he's written a reflection on British self-identity in the wake of Brexit, Island Stories, an unconventional history of Britain. And it's perhaps partly from some of those reflections that he will draw today in thinking about English, and we are quite specifically referring to the English, not the British, in this instance, English memory and amnesia about empire. So without anything further from me, David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Simon, and it's a great pleasure to be with you today, even if it's virtual. As Simon said, I'm talking off the back of this particular book, Island Stories, which was written because of my dissatisfaction with the way that narratives about our history, and the our tended to be English shaped history, were being circulated during the Brexit debate and afterwards. And I think they are still part of the general challenge that the English / British have about dealing with Brexit. So what I want to do is expound a set of themes about English memory and empire. Empire understood in two ways: the internal empire within these islands and the external empire across the seas. My peg is a book that was published more than a century ago, Our Island Story, A History of England for Boys and Girls, which went through many editions. I think it may well still be in print. It was particularly pushed by the Conservative or the coalition government, Conservative-led coalition government from 2010. Michael Gove, who was then Education Secretary, declared all pupils will learn Our Island Story. David Cameron, the Prime Minister, was a great fan of this book and spoke highly of it as one of his favorite history books. And against that, I want to offer as a kind of counterpoint Rudyard Kipling's injunction, what should they know of England who only England know? In other words, that if one simply focuses on any one country, England, Ireland, France, whatever, one tends to get a rather myopic view of past, present, and future. And that's really what I want to talk about. My jumping off point is this book, The Expansion of England by J.R. Seeley, Sir John Seeley, published in 1883, a book which was read by generations of British policymakers and particularly empire builders. It didn't, in fact, go out of print, I believe, until 1956, which those of you who are historically savvy will remember was the year of Suez, so rather appropriate for its, as it were, departure from the printed book list. And what Seeley talks about is the expansion of England in two ways. First of all, to create what he calls Great Britain, and then to create Greater Britain across the seas, the British Empire. And what I think is clear from Seeley, and indeed from many other pieces of work, is the, if you like, the imperial project of the strong English monarchy, possibly even before the Norman conquest, certainly afterwards. A Norman conquest, which of course meant that the realm of England was also part of, connected to a realm in France. And indeed, that was the case for 4 centuries, really, until the middle of the 15th century. But let's think here about empire building on these islands, because my theme is very much that there are 2 islands in this project. The island of what became Britain and the island of Ireland. And those histories have been fatefully entangled. Here are 2 major empire builders of the past, Edward I, notorious as the hammer of the Scots and also of the Welsh. Think of those great castles across North Wales at Harlech and Carnarvon and Conway and so on. Henry VIII, who brings Wales formally within the English polity, imposes an English county system on Wales, and of course stamps his mark on Ireland. 2 major empire builders within our islands. What also matters in our island story, in the narrative, English narrative sense, is the sense of being a providential nation. We can't really understand the history of England and England's sense of self-identity without the enormous impact of the Protestant Reformation, starting with Henry's break with Rome, and then the gradual creeping Protestantization of the polity. And here are 2 moments in that story celebrated in English mythology and indeed in English holidays, holy days for a century or more. The failure of the Spanish Armada from Catholic Spain to conquer England, Protestant England. There's the English fleet. There's the threatening Spanish fleet, and in the top right of that little picture, you can see the Protestant wind with divine favor blowing the Catholic ships around, away from England, up the coast, up the northeast coast of England, around Scotland and Ireland, and of course many of them getting wrecked. And then the other act of providence, the foiling of the gunpowder plot to blow up the king and parliament. By then a different king, not Elizabeth, but monarch, but James I, in 1605. And the gunpowder plot and its foiling is another example of God protecting the Protestant nation, the providential nation in the English story. This is also a providential nation that expands globally. From the 16th century onwards, we see the expansion of England as a naval power. The naval power is what helps to give England security from the wars that engulfed the continent in the 16th and 17th centuries. And that's an image there of the Spanish Armada. But what we also need to remember is that the English Empire and what becomes the British Empire in the 17th and 18th century is also founded on slave power as well as sea power. That's a part of the story of empire that is only just being recovered in familiar British narratives. But people trafficking, the Atlantic slave trade amounts to probably 3 or 4 million people in the course of the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries. It played a huge part in generating the commercial revolution, which helped to lay the basis of the industrial revolution in Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries, through the development of plantations to grow sugar in the Caribbean, tobacco in the southern part of the American colonies, later the United States. So sea power and slave power, an important part of this global expansion of England. If we return to these islands, there is, however, a problem of security within these islands. Not so much from repulsing the enemy abroad, but from dealing with anarchy and turmoil at home. It has been suggested, it's been estimated that over 7 centuries, from the 11th century until the middle of the 18th century, up to, shall we say, the Battle of Culloden, only 3 British monarchs were not either engaged in an invasion of Scotland or in repulsing an invasion from Scotland. That relationship between England and Scotland was a fraught one for 7 centuries. And at the time, at the end of the Tudor period, with Elizabeth having no heir, James VI of Scotland, Protestant king, is invited to take the throne of England as well. James VI of Scotland becomes also James I of England. This union of the crowns, as it's called, is then complemented by the union of the polities, of the parliaments, in 1707. The Act of Union, there's an image of the Scottish parliamentarians bringing their Act of Union to Queen Anne in 1707. This is a formal union of the 2 parliaments. Scotland, though, of course, retains significant pieces of autonomy, its own legal system, its own church, and so on. That union, which in 1707 becomes the United Kingdom of Great Britain, is then extended in 1801 to Ireland. But in the meantime, there is a growing sense of British identity, the emphasis on Protestantism, Scotland and England, and also the emphasis on parliamentary government at a time of the era of Louis XIV and others, where Catholic absolutist kings and monarchs are ruling and rampant on the continent. So this sense of Britishness, this forging of the nation, Linda Colley's deliberately ambiguous term, it's attempted to extend to Ireland in 1801. And of course, the catalyst in both cases, 1707 and 1801, are England's wars with France. The fear that through the back door, through Scotland or through Ireland, the enemy will be able to threaten Britain, even if it can't, as it were, cross the channel, it can do it through the back door. So that sense of security is fundamental in the extension of the United Kingdom to Ireland. It is, of course, a different story, and Irish historians will talk about this, I'm sure, in the festival, a different kind of union in the case of Ireland to Scotland. Scotland, if I may put it simply, is in a position to hold its own within the union with England. There's already a well-developed commercial system, legal system, a sense of intellectual confidence, the Scottish Enlightenment, so that Scotland can punch above its weight. And of course, it gets real benefits from getting into what I think one would have to call the English single market. For example, Glasgow merchants are extremely successful in developing the tobacco trade with the American colonies, and also, of course, the slave trade that goes with that. In the case of Ireland, in my outside observer estimation, it's more of a colonial relationship. England runs Ireland through a viceroy, the kind of language that's used and governance that's used in the colonies. And it's also a situation where the less developed industrialized economy of most of Ireland means that this is much more of a country that is a resource in terms of raw materials, food, and human power for the development of the English and Scottish economies. A story which particularly goes so tragically and completely wrong in the course of the famine in the middle of the 19th century. Which I think is when my own relatives came over, the Reynolds family, from Ireland to England. So a different story for Scotland and Ireland, but part of this empire building project within the islands mounted by Britain. And it is, of course, the empire that makes Britain great overseas. This is the kind of image that one is familiar with, the sense of a world painted with colors of pink, including these big settler colonies. You can see Canada there, Australia, New Zealand, later on South Africa, but also the colonies of conquest, as Seeley talked about it, such as India. Of course, now we would see Australia and Canada, and they would see themselves as colonies of conquest as well. But Seeley made a rather abrupt distinction because he was very much a believer in the greater British people, the sense that the frontiers in Australia and Canada and so on were what would really toughen up the British race for the struggle against other rivals. Because as you can see, these are tiny islands, and they are faced with countries, huge continental powers that are developing. The United States of America holding together after the Civil War in 1865, the Russian Tsarist Empire expanding in the 19th century across Asia. These are countries that have got a much bigger power base in terms of territory than and people and population than Britain, so that the sense of the empire as being the base for British power is fundamental. It's a different kind of empire, a colonial empire, not a continental empire, if you like, in the sense of the Russian Tsars or the American so-called Empire of Liberty. So Britain, if you like, is in a situation where it has a remarkable rise to the position of world power. It is intrinsically amazing that a country of this size is in the position of controlling half the world's trade in manufactures in the middle of the 19th century and so on. It's a position that can't last. And indeed, in many ways, while you might say that the rise of Britain as an imperial power, a global power, is what's historically surprising, its decline from that position, its relative decline, is not surprising. In the course of the 20th century, these new challenges make themselves evident. Here's a cartoon from a cover of Puck, one of the weeklies in the middle of the in 1909. It shows the naval race. You can see there the Japanese brandishing a battleship. There's the Kaiser with his little arsenal, naval arsenal behind the chair. You've got the portly French, you've got John Bull, I think, and you've got Uncle Sam puffing away. These are the kind of rivals that England or Britain is having to face. And of course, it leads to two different kinds of world wars, 1914-18, 1939-45. So let's move into a period that is, of course, hugely important and hugely tragic for Irish history and indeed for the relations between Britain and Ireland, the Great War. And what I would say here is that's important from the perspective I'm adopting is the way that the Great War creates divided memories. If you like, here graphically, this is the division of Ireland, the partition of Ireland, independence after a bloody civil war, bloody war of independence and then civil war for the Free State, and the Ulster remaining within the United Kingdom. So it becomes the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And as we know, successive governments in London, although they might have started by saying partition is a temporary expedient, a breathing space, were very happy to forget about it, forget about the situation, as long as it didn't become too toxic for politics in London. The Great War tells us, I think, or has a different resonance if we look at Britain itself. What's often forgotten is that although the pressures for Irish home rule are hugely intense in the late 19th century and for the Liberal government before the First World War, there's also a strong home rule movement in Scotland. Indeed, a home rule bill for Scotland goes through, has a second reading in the House of Commons in 1913. There's also, in a different way, a strong pressure for a sense of Welsh identity, which takes shape more in cultural terms rather than political terms, but it takes the form of a campaign to disestablish the Anglican Church in Wales, which is the bastion of English landlord power. But this sense of a crisis of the United Kingdom all round dissipates in Britain during the course of the First World War, the Great War, because of the shared sacrifice of Welsh and Scottish regiments, I think, and of the industrial workforces in the war to preserve the empire. That is just one example. That's the memorial to the 51st Highland Division on the Somme. You can find similar ones for Welsh regiments. It's in this period, I think, that Scots and Welsh feel a new sense of pride in their own achievements as Scots and Welsh, but also a sense of participation in the British project. So it's a sense that they can be Welsh and British and proud of both, Scots and British and proud of both. And this is a lasting legacy, I think, that it lasts, it's renewed, if you like, in the Second World War, and it lasts for much of the 20th century. And I'll come on in a moment to the how that, if you like, begins to ebb. Along the way, what we have, of course, equally potent is the end of empire. There's a wonderful image of an empire on which the sun never sets, literally and supposedly metaphorically. That is one example in the bottom right. Independence in India, August 1947. A consequence, a direct consequence of the Second World War. One of the things that English memory is particularly partial about is the way in which it remembers bits of the Second World War and not others. So 1940, our finest hour, Churchillian moment, is on your screens all the time. It's a regular trope for politicians. Little attention is paid to the disastrous fall of Singapore in 1942 as Japanese power brushes away the Asian empire and threatens India itself. Although the British, like the French and the Dutch, get back into their empires at the end of the Second World War, that sense of the prestige of the white race, and I think one has to put it in that way, is damaged forever by the effect of Japan's really dramatic Pacific-wide blitzkrieg in 1941-42. And the shaking of the foundations of the Raj in India is just one example of that. How does that matter for these islands? Well, because I think one of the cements holding the sense of the union, the United Kingdom together, was that feeling of an imperial project in which Scots, Welsh, and of course many Irish participated. Irish manpower in terms of soldiering, in terms of the navy, in terms of imperial governors and things like that, played a significant part in the 19th century empire. And of course, there was substantial participation of Irish troops in the British armed forces in both world wars. So that was a part of the story that was, if you like, played down by the Free State, the Republic, after independence. But for all the participant countries, by the last third of the 20th century, empire is no longer a unifying cause. it's part of the, it becomes, the decolonization becomes one of the elements chipping away at the cement of the Union, the United Kingdom. In the short term, the response to decolonization is joining a new Europe. A new Europe that is founded against all expectations, certainly in London, by the Treaty of Rome in 1957. 6 countries, all of them in one way or either the defeated or the overrun during the Second World War. In other words, Germany and Italy as the former Axis powers, France, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg as countries that were overrun by Germany. Against all expectations, they come together in the Treaty of Rome. They form a European community, European economic community that really takes off. The British, having ignored that integration process in the 50s, scrabble to catch up. Because of 2 vetoes by General de Gaulle, President de Gaulle, they do not join until 15 years after the European Economic Community came into existence in 58. And in those 15 years, the character of that community set hard. If I'm looking for historical turning points in the Brexit story, it's the British failure to get involved in integration in the 1950s. In many ways, that poisons the chalice all the way through the story, because by the time Britain joins, one, the character of that union is formed, and formed largely by French, according to what the French want. And secondly, when we do join, it's just at the period, at the moment when the huge surge of post-war growth tails off, and we end up with oil crisis in 73, global depression, stagflation, all the things that make joining the European community a constant slog as far as Britain is concerned. So as with so many things in history, timing matters. So that was the attempted solution to post-colonial Britain, as I say, in some ways flawed from the beginning. In terms of relations within these islands, I draw attention to something that I feel was fundamentally ignored by English Leave politicians during the Brexit debate, and indeed, it would have to be said by the Cameron government, namely what I would call for shorthand the Millennium Settlement of 1988 and 1989. Meaning by that, and I'm using that term in inverted commas, it's tendentious, but I think it is valid. On the one hand, after 30 years of the Troubles, this remarkable period in which, in so many complicated, crabwise ways, Belfast and Dublin, London and Dublin managed to come together. On the British side, it's something that's promoted by 2 British prime ministers, John Major, often forgotten, Tony Blair. It also involves extensive commitments by successive Irish governments and assistance from the United States. It's one of the most, I think, significant international agreements of the late 20th century, and it's now often taken for granted, certainly in England. Complementing it is the attempt by the Blair government to take seriously the growing pressures for more of a recognition of identity in Scotland and in Wales, a devolution of power or some powers. One of those powers that's handed over because London governments didn't think it was going to amount to much was health. We've seen in the last year or two how important health issues are in separating out these different 4 different polities, England, Scotland, Ireland, Northern Ireland and Wales. But anyway, at the time, this is a significant concession, and one that appears to be satisfying the demands for devolution within Britain. And although the Scottish National Party gains power successfully to the point where it can push for a referendum in 2014, the separatist challenge is headed off in that at that moment in 2014, at the referendum. So if you like, what we have by 2015 are two unions: the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, in a new relationship, evolving, fragile, but definitely a huge progress with the Republic of Ireland. And also, and it helps, and this all helps, membership of a 28-strong European community. Don't worry about all the letters. It's the blue that matters. It's a huge area. It's a huge grouping. And although the European Union had very little to do with the, as I understand it, with the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, it played a very big part quietly in what might be termed functional integration across the Irish border over the next 20 years or so, just helping to smooth out some of those frictional relationships, bring the two governments into closer working relationships, which is, of course, what it had done historically right across the continent of Europe, from Western Europe, bringing France and Germany together, and then extending that process in the 2000s as it was opened up to former Eastern Europe. So you could say there is a situation there that is has many problems, many flaws, but is essentially positive. That is all destroyed by Brexit, or by the results of the referendum. I think it's clear that neither Remain nor Leave gave any serious thought to what would happen if there was a majority for leaving. There were no contingency plans. David Cameron forbade it. But also there was very little attempt to even imagine what the implications would be for the United Kingdom. What we have here is the results mapped across the four polities. Of course, that picture didn't matter because, as Theresa May was at pains to say, we are a united country and therefore it's a majority decision. Every vote counts in a way that, of course, is not the case in a normal British United Kingdom general election, where you pick up the votes, you count the votes by constituencies and then award the seat to the majority party. Here, every vote counted, and in the end, what was crucial was the fact that 85%, roughly speaking, of the population of the United Kingdom are in England, and the English voted overwhelmingly to leave. So did the Welsh, but of course, famously, the Scots voted 62% to remain. And in Northern Ireland, the vote was, I think, around 56%. So what we've got now is a situation of trying to work out what the implications are of the whole Brexit process. And I think of Brexit as a continuing process. I don't think it just was sorted out on the 31st of January, 2020 for this union, the United Kingdom. I mentioned that Seeley talked about the expansion of England. The process I have been describing is really the contraction of England. And what I'm trying to suggest is that the contraction involves not simply the contraction of the empire abroad, but potentially of the empire at home as well. So if I wanted to sum up just a few points, right the way through, England has been engaged in, I think, what could be reasonably described as an imperial project in these islands and beyond. English rulers, medieval kings and their successors. In that process, Protestantism was hugely important, a providential, the idea of a providential, civilizing nation, bringing godly rule, and also the values of civilization to the outlying parts, not just of the world, but also to the outlying parts of the island. So it meant particularly the Highlanders and Ireland, much of Ireland as well. That was how it was viewed. What helped to hold things together was this concept of a united kingdom. United for peace, the best way to deal with the Scottish problem, the Irish problem, and also a kingdom that is devoted and committed to the outward push for empire, for the civilizing empire. Global Britain, in those days, I'm using the term, of course, it's a Brexit term as well, but it was always a complicated mixture of sea power and slave power, commerce, settlement, and colonies. As Adam Smith said, it was not so much an empire, but a project of an empire, a project that was never, always in flux and never completed. The empire itself, the rise was remarkable historically, the decline was historically predictable. And what we're now dealing with in this period of the contraction of England from a global power, I think, to a much more regional power, and also the contraction of English control of the islands. It's been exposed above all by Brexit, an English project that I think ignored the extent of devolution within the UK, achieved at the end of the 20th century in what I've termed the Millennium Settlement. And also, of course, the centrality of the European Union, of membership of the European Union to the Irish question or questions. So I leave that with you, and I look forward to being involved in a panel where we can talk more about it in due course. Thank you.
David, thank you.